Folks, we're running late as usual. We were supposed to start 5 minutes ago. We have 3 sessions, and it's not fair that someone as distinguished as Nathalie should have only 15 minutes, but I'm sure she's quite capable of enlightening us in that. She has just told me something that utterly amazes me. I have known her for many years and always thought that her name was Nathalie Heinich.
Heinich.
And it's now Heinich.
Heinich. Heinich. You can improve, you know, Heinich.
Terribly Francais, in other words.
Thank you. So thanks a lot for your kind invitation. Part of Johan Goudsblom's work was his action in favor of better knowledge and dissemination of Elias' thought. Should we consider this action out of date now that Elias is internationally recognized as one of the most important sociologists of all times? I do not think so, since only part of his thought has become familiar to social scientists, while some fundamental aspects of his theoretical insights keep being unknown or misunderstood, especially outside sociology. This is why Goudsblom's efforts have to be continued, and this should be considered the most faithful tribute to his whole life dedication. In line with this conviction, I conceived a special issue of the French journal Cité dedicated to the present influence of Elias' thought in the francophone social sciences. Norbert Elias, un penseur, Norbert Elias, as we say in French, Norbert Elias, un penseur à redécouvrir, a thinker to be rediscovered. This is the image of the small conference I organized at the German Institute in Paris in last January, where some of you took place. It was dedicated to the presentation of this issue. So my first goal when preparing this issue was to enlarge the reception of Elias' thought not only to sociologists and historians who are already familiar with it, but also to specialists from other disciplines, philosophers, psychoanalysts, anthropologists, political scientists, and so on, and even to the more general public. In short, this dossier is about considering Elias as a thinker and not just as a sociologist, as indicated in the title. My second objective has been to extend the knowledge of Elias' thought not only in the space of disciplines and of his potential readers, but also in time, focusing not on the past of his publications, but on the present of its current influence, and consequently on its chances of counting even more in the future of the social sciences. This is why I asked the contributors from several disciplines to propose a kind of inventory of its presence in their field. Another challenge came from the conviction that Elias' thought is not known as it should be because some of its aspects have become so familiar that it tends to be reduced to them, particularly the theory of the civilizing process, while others are often ignored even if they are as important, at least in my opinion. The spectrum should thus be open in order to include the works of maturity published from the 1980s. And to better understand this break in his work between youth before 1939 and maturity, it is interesting to take into account not only the chronology of publications, but also the chronology of translations into French, since what is at stake in this dossier is the influence of this thought in the French-speaking world. This is why in my presentation I propose to distinguish 3 waves of translations into French. The first wave mainly concerned historians with the translation in the mid-1970s of La civilisation des mœurs in 1973, La dynamique de l'Occident in 1975, the 2 parts of the civilizing process, and in between, La société de cours in 1974. The second wave occurred in the 1980s and 1990s with a series of translations that enabled not only sociologists and historians, but also political scientists and philosophers to appreciate the variety of themes addressed by Elias. What is Sociology, 1981, The Solitude of the Dying, I say it in English, it's easier for you, The Solitude of the Dying in 1985, The Society of Individuals in 1990, Norbert Elias by himself in 1991, the same years as his Mozart. Involvement and Detachment in 1993, Sport and Civilization in 1994, On Time in 1996, and finally, The Established and the Outsiders in 1997. It was on the basis of these first two waves of translations that I was able to publish in 1997, for the centenary of his birth, the first presentation of his work to French readers, La Sociologie de Norbert Elias. Finally, a third wave of translations from the beginning of the 21st century has completed the widening of the perception of Elias's work by French-speaking readers by opening it up to the history of art, psychoanalysis, philosophy, epistemology, and anthropology. The third wave has been composed either of collected papers published during Elias's lifetime in English or in German, or of important texts which have suffered translation delays because of editorial difficulties. Écrit sur l'art africain in 2000, Au-delà de Freud in 2010, Théorie du symbole in 2015, La dynamique sociale de la conscience in 2016, the same year as Humana Conditio and I Followed My Own Path, Les Allemands, the Germans, in 2017, Le déclin de l'art de cour in 2019, and finally, Moyen Âge et processus de civilisation, the first part of the civilizing process not included in the first translation, in 2021, that is quite recently. Those second and third waves of translations should, I think, support the reassessment of the importance of Elias's thought, given that these works of maturity include highly original theoretical openings which deserve to be explored far beyond the theory of the civilizing process belonged to his early work. Indeed, it is precisely by considering this mature work that we can fully appreciate the phenomenal importance of Elias's thought for social sciences. Let me summarize now his major theoretical contributions, the ones I wanted to show to my French and Francophone colleagues. The first contribution is its non-critical use of history. Far from the cliché of the socially constructed, Elias's historical perspective serves exclusively to describe, to explain, and to understand evolutionary processes rather than to dismiss their objects as in critical sociology or anthropology. It is therefore, above all, an epistemic tool and not an ideological weapon. Correlatively, the focus on processes, evolutions, reverses the traditional perception that makes stability the norm and change the exception. For Elias, what is normal is that social realities evolve, and what he studies is never an object, be it self-constrained civility, relationship to death, to violence, etc., but the contextual organization and reorganization of the practices and representations that pertain to it. Hence, a certain number of misunderstandings about his thought due to a fixist and substantialist reading of phenomena. This processual dimension therefore constitutes a second major theoretical contribution. A third one is his refusal to dissociate the social collective dimension from the psychological individual dimension. As indicated by the concept of habitus, parallel to that of Bourdieu, there is no caesura other than disciplinary between these two dimensions of experience, the social and the individual, but only an articulation which, according to the context, varies from the most interiorized or even unconscious to the most exterior and collective or even institutionalized. In other words, the body and the social body are only different moments of the same co-construction. A fourth major contribution lies in the systematic articulation between the micro, meso, and macro levels. There, it is the key concept of configuration which makes it possible to leave the traditional opposition between individual and society by affirming, on the one hand, that there cannot exist individuals without society. This is the criticism of the illusion of homoclausus. And, on the other hand, that the individual and the social construct each other mutually in variable contexts ranging from inter-individual interactions to institutionalized relationship. Society does not exist, but only more or less extended spatial-temporal configurations endowed with their own characteristics, like individuals. This concept of configuration generates two other major conceptual contributions. First of all, fifth contribution, the human experience must be read primarily in the light of the concept of interdependency. Not only are individuals not closed in on themselves, and not only are they also constitutively in relation to each other, but, moreover, their very definition is modified according to these relations, as the metaphor of the net clearly illustrates. Interdependency more than interaction, and above all more than domination, which is henceforth nothing more than a particular interpretation of certain types of interdependency. This is enough to wring the necks of a substantial number of pseudo-sociological analyses. Also related to the concept of configuration is the sixth major contribution. Human experience is not made up of predetermined entities that would exist independently of their implementation, but it produces these regularities that we call society, time, civilization, etc. Thus, a society is nothing other than the aggregation of individual lives carried by representations, materialized in objects, supported by institutions. In other words, the abstract categories that allow us to think about experience are not metaphysical substances, but names given to our representations. It's okay. This is the nominalist conception, which makes society the product of human actions and not their predetermined framework, cause, or origin. Contrary to the holism of the social, proper to Durkheim's sociology, still influenced by metaphysical philosophy, Elias's sociology is at the same time pragmatic. It is human actions which make the regularities of experience and not the other way around, relationist and individualist in the strictly methodological sense. That is, the sociologist must go through the description of these interdependent actions in order to then be able to generalize so as to identify recurrences. Finally, Elias introduced the issue of distancing into the toolbox of the social sciences. Underlying the concept of civilizing process, it was problematized, as you all know, as such in involvement and detachment. Coupled with its antonym, the concept of quest for excitement, conceptualized in sport and civilization as an end in itself for actors, distancing offers a dynamic and consubstantially conflicting conception of the evolution towards civility, all the more when correlated with reflexivity. It should lead to a re-examination of the history of the social sciences, for which Elias paved the way without being followed there as much as one might hope. Let me sum up. a non-critical, processual, integrative, contextual, nominalist, pragmatist, and reflexive conception of the social world. All this rids us of a lot of useless baggage bequeathed by tradition, and in particular, the theological idea that there would be a predetermined meaning of life history, or even that there would exist a social pre-existing to human actions and which would explain them. This is, according to me, the great turning point that Elias's thought offers to the human and social sciences. I had initially proposed as a title for this dossier, Norbert Elias, Le Retour, the coming back of Elias. It means for me that his thought is not only behind us, but also and above all in front of us, to be fully included into the intellectual space of the human and social sciences. I am convinced that so much still remains to be done in order to offer Elias's theoretical thought the interdisciplinary reception it deserves. I would be very proud if I could act in the Francophone world as Goudsblom did, together with some other scholars, in the Anglophone one. This is why I decided to dedicate this special issue to the memory of Johan Goudsblom as a tribute to his intellectual action in favor of a better knowledge and understanding of Elias's thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie. We have really 5 minutes for a question or two. Just like to comment that the idea of redécouvrir Elias hits the nail on the head, because one of the things that most irritates me looking back over a lifetime in sociology is the way in which, for theorists particularly, sociology seems not to be a matter of anything cumulative, but a matter of fads and fashions, where every latest gimmicky thinker is hailed and then eventually forgotten. Elias does not deserve that fate.
Thank you. Well, I just would like to draw your attention that Nathalie has written an excellent book on Bourdieu entitled Pourquoi Bourdieu? Why Bourdieu? Book words to be translated anyway into English. But my question concerns the school, the Bourdieusian school. Mm-hmm. Could you say a few words about the reception of Elias within the Bourdieusian school, formally and informally? What was the reaction of this camp to the master?
Okay, so I heard the name of Elias for the first time when I attended Bourdieu's seminar at the end of the 1970s, since I was doing my PhD with him, and he was very positive when speaking of Elias, really positive, and I read Elias owing to Bourdieu. I rediscovered myself Elias in the 80s, and I read it under a totally different angle, perspective, and this helped me a lot to get out of Bourdieu's thought. The problem is that after having said a lot of good of Elias's civilizing process, 10 years after, Bourdieu began to criticize the way in which Elias did not care enough about domination. And this went together with Bourdieu's tendency to go more and more toward an involved activist sociology, political sociology, which became during the 80s and exploded during the 90s. So the more we go into his thought, and the more we see him take distance from Elias. And I'm not quite sure that he really read the works of maturity, the ones translated during the 80s and during the 90s. Anyway, I don't see any trace of this in his work. As for his followers, you know, they are not very, let's say, curious, intellectually curious. So I'm not sure they have really read Elias. And I don't read very attentively Bourdieu's followers because I'm not very interested in what they are doing. But I'm not sure Elias is a reference for them. I'm sure he's not.
Of course, Parisian academic politics can be pretty brutal, and I remember maybe nearly 30 years ago now, Emmanuel Ladurie attacked Elias as a way of trying to prevent Roger Chartier from getting into the Collège de France. You remember? Yes. I mean, bizarre. Sorry.
Quickly, just to comment on what you just said. In les cours sur l'État, Bourdieu, at the beginning, immediately at the beginning, say, because when he was talking about the state in a historical perspective, he say, I'm asking now the help of Elias. He's the one who's going to help me to get out of this problem of history. I need Elias. It's a beautiful embracing of the work of Elias. I've never seen that such a great statement than him. That's why I think Bourdieu, indeed, his idea of habitus is a little bit different because he divided like eidos, hexes, and all these stuff. But it's not different from the one of Elias at all. I think there is a huge compatibility, and putting Elias together with Bourdieu, it makes the most powerful sociology that I have, and that's why I am from the Amsterdam School, and that's what Abraham de Swan did in this.
So the work on the state dates from the mid-1980s, at a time when Bourdieu was still considering Elias as a sociologist who takes into account history, which was fundamental and which was obvious in the civilizing process. So I think this is the reason why he insisted on the use of Elias in this historical perspective. But the focus on domination, I think, is a part of Bourdieu's work which doesn't fit so well with Elias's, thought in all his richness. And you cannot both focus on domination and on interdependency. You have to choose, you know, before these two ways of interpreting things. And Elias chose, of course, the side of interdependency. This is, I think, one of the reasons why Bourdieu's followers don't have the use of Elias. They cannot use it. Yeah.
Even could we ask Johan Hellbrand to comment from his home? He must be listening in.
Yes. Maybe he does not agree, yes. we met with Johan, we met at Bourdieu seminar, you know, 40 years ago. So
it's a little beyond my technical capabilities at this point. Well, I'll go out now. In the meantime, Linda, you like have a go.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Nathalie. I have another question because it somehow happens that we always end up talking about Bourdieu, even though we don't want to, and maybe you don't want to, right? So I was wondering, with this sort of a return of Norbert Elias also in the Francophone world, where do you see the most fertile communities of theorists or research would be?
Well, I'm afraid that I have to answer that I let you read this special issue because, you know, so it's a kind of inventory. So there's one philosopher, one sociologist, two historians, one jurist. I really wanted to have a jurist. And I really tried to have an anthropologist, and I couldn't find one. There is an incredible reluctancy among French anthropologists in front of Elias, I thought, because a lot of them are persuaded that this is, kind of position in favor of civility of the Occident in front of the incivility of, well, you know, all these stupid things. And they also have a very evolutionary vision of Elias's relationship to history. So a lot of misunderstandings, and I wanted to lift them up, but I couldn't find an anthropologist who accepted. So, well, you have several persons among historians, sociologists, somehow philosophers, some jurists who read Elias and can use it. But it doesn't make a school. You don't have a French school of Eliasians, Eliasiens. No.
I'm told that Johan Heilbronn can indeed be boomed into this room. Johan, are you there?
Yes.
It's like a seance.
At least it's phantom, yeah.
It doesn't seem to be working, no Johan, but maybe we can get a comment later.
Okay.
I think we must thank you at this juncture and move on to the next Let me introduce my old friend Robert van Krieken, who, odd to relate, was my successor at UCD, but didn't stay there because he arrived in the middle of the economic crash and things were not good. So he comes to us, as usual today, from Australia.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen. This is working all right? Yes, it's fine. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to Johan and Nico for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming along today. I'll apologise in advance for my less elegant Australian accent. I'm afraid I can't make it sound as Nathalie's lovely French accent, but I'll do my best to kind of tone it down. Brum once told me that I actually move quite haphazardly from a very strong accent to a very weak one. But anyway, we'll see how we go. Okay, this paper bounces off a paper that Jog-Goudsblom wrote in 1980. It was a paper that he presented to the German Sociological Association's conference in Bremen. It was called Zum Hintergrund der Zivilisationstheorie von Norbert Elias, das Verhältnis zu Hausinger, Weber und Freud. The text of that presentation was revised and published in German in 1984 in the second volume of the Macht und Zivilisation collections. And it was subsequently translated, I think, by Job himself, I'm not sure, into Dutch in 1987. But it hasn't been translated into English yet, which I always thought was a pity, and I've actually done that translation, and the journal History of the Human Sciences is happy to publish it, which they will as soon as I finish an introduction to it. But I think I've been avoiding it, and I think I wanted to come to this conference first and engage with all of you before I wrote that introduction. Now, that paper I've always found is a very interesting and highly significant discussion of Elias's relationship with other writers in history, sociology and psychology. It emphasises the location of his work at the intersection of those three disciplines. And that's a really important point to make. I mean, the historian Peter Burke emphasises this too, right? He describes Elias's work as the most successful and exemplary effort to link history, sociology and psychoanalysis. Now, with respect to Freud, Goudsblom observed that one can discern a great deal of the program of Elias's on the process in a passage in Freud's new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, but also that Elias adopted a different approach to drives in a way that the social formation, that recognised the social formation of the natural raw material of drives, as he put it, and made it clear that the formation of individual emotional life needs to be understood, as you will all understand, within the context of increasingly complex social interdependencies. Now, since then, Elias's essay, Freud's Concept of Society and Beyond It, has been published both in French and in English. I'm not sure about German. And there has also been, there are also important aspects of his engagement with Freudian theory in other writings, such as What is Sociology, Sociology and Psychiatry, and in the Society of Individuals. If you go looking for it, there's actually quite a lot of Freud in a lot of his writings, which all suggest that his relationship to Freud is even more complex than Goudsblom had the space to discuss in that paper. Freud was one of the recipients of a pre-publication copy of Über den Prozess, and Elias treasured the postcard acknowledging receipt from Freud all his life. And he wrote in 1985, "Without Freud, I would not have been able to write what I have written. His theory was essential for my work, and his concepts, ego, superego, libido, etc., are very familiar to me." So even though Elias avoided detailed discussions of Freudian theory, and that was part of his overall approach to not actually spend too much time engaging in theoretical discussion, he did often acknowledge his debt to Freud in interviews, and in reality, a great deal of his writing can be understood as a debate with Freud's ghost, to an extent that's not usually appreciated. In addition to relatively recent writings such as Michael Rustin's on sociology and psychoanalysis, George Cavaletto's book Crossing the Psychosocial Divide, Bernard Lahir's paper on Elias and Freud, there's also a very extensive discussion in the German language literature in the writings of Reinhard Blomhead, Michael Schroeder, Mario Erdheim and Hans Koenig that remains untranslated and makes important contributions to the development of Goudsblom's earlier account. So his initial observations about Elias's relationship to Freud can be approached as a springboard for a more detailed examination of the connections between Elias and Freud, but not just Freud himself, right? And this is what I want to emphasize, but also with post-Freudian psychoanalysis more broadly. And I really want to emphasize that it's important to not just think in terms of Elias and Freud, but Elias and Freud and post-Freudian psychoanalytic theory. I'll explain why shortly. The important issues include Elias's concept of drives and his introduction of the concept of valencies, the extent to which Elias could be said to have historicized psychoanalytic thinking, Elias's account of Freud as adhering to a homo clausus conception of human beings, and the ways in which his understanding of humans as open personalities shows strong affinities with post-Freudian object relations theory, and the extent to which Elias's conception of national habitus rests on a particular mobilization of psychoanalytic concepts. So the points I want to emphasize is the ways in which making the psychoanalytic dimensions of Elias's thought more explicit, building on Joop's initial observations, can enrich and expand the ways in which the long-term development of emotional life as a process of civilization is analysed in historical sociology. Secondly, the importance of Elias's approach for the question of the need for an engagement between psychoanalysis and history, particularly in relation to the historical sociology of emotions. So Goudsblom wrote, "The linking of psychoanalysis with historical social research has both given the latter a broader psychological basis and increased the sociological reach of the former." Now, the conceptual concern at the heart on the process was precisely to historicise psychology from a sociological perspective, and he termed his approach historical social psychology. And this was an approach that he had in common with the French historian Lucien Febvre, but they both use very different bodies of psychological theory. As I've just said, it was Freud and psychoanalytic theory that were crucial to Elias's approach. Throughout his writings, there's an ongoing tension between, on the one hand, his very thoughtful and considered appreciation of key Freudian and psychoanalytic concepts and modes of thinking, and the ambition to go beyond Freud. Right? So he's both trying to engage with it as in a very kind of detailed way and to go beyond it. And what I'd like to say is that is often works well, and sometimes it works less well. Right? So there are times when I agree with his observations about how Freud's approach can be, revised or developed. But there are other times when there are things about Freud's own approach that get lost and that could possibly be retrieved rather than simply abandoned. So in all three arenas, his mobilisation of Freudian and post-Freudian concepts, his efforts to develop psychoanalysis in a more historical sociological directions, and those times when he abandons or simply overlooks some key Freudian ideas, working through the nuances and complexities of Elias's relationship with psychoanalysis constitutes a very useful window onto a number of important conceptual issues. So I wanted to treat Job's essay as a kind of impetus towards engaging in those kind of debates. Now, because I don't have much time, I'll just quickly outline the next section, which was about the foundations of Elias's work in Freud's own work. In a way, he doesn't actually acknowledge his debt as much as he could have, right? Because there's a lot of what Elias was concerned with that you can find in Freud before him, right? So the debt is possibly more extensive than even Elias's acknowledgements have suggested. So the core thesis of On the Process and an argument for a historical approach to sociology was in fact articulated by Freud in 1927 in The Future of an Illusion, where he rejected the idea that the human mind has remained the same throughout history, and highlighted one particular way in which it had changed, and I quote, "It is in keeping with the course of human development that external coercion gradually becomes internalised. For a special mental agency, man's superego, takes it over and includes it among its commandments. Those in whom it has taken place are turned from being opponents of civilization into being its vehicles. The greater their number is in a cultural unit, the more secure is its culture and the more it can dispense with external measures of coercion." Earlier, Freud had also emphasised the historical perspective when he wrote that, and I quote again, "In the last resort, it may be assumed that every internal compulsion which makes itself felt in the development of human beings was originally, that is, in the history of mankind, only an external one. And it is in this sense that the human being is subject not only to the pressure of his immediate cultural environment, but also to the influence of the cultural history of his ancestors." And there are other points where he says similar kinds of things. So there are also points in Elias's writings where, despite his concern to go beyond Freud, he actually is providing a thoroughly Freudian account of human subjective experience over every individual's lifetime, sometimes almost in contradiction to his concern to distinguish himself from Freud. For Freud, the reduction of aggression between people demanded by the development of civilization needed to be seen as associated with an increase in aggression that people directed internally towards themselves, and this was the central discontent of civilization. And then Elias elaborates on exactly this On the Process, when he writes, for example, that with the establishment of a pattern of near-automatic habits, a specific superego, the battlefield is in a sense moved within. The drives, the passionate effects that can no longer directly manifest themselves in the relationship between people often struggle no less violently within the individual against this supervising part of themselves. I should say this passage On the Process is written in a way that actually channels Freud a lot more than other parts of his writing. He's very sensitive to how painful the whole process of becoming a human can be, and he uses words like scars, wounds, pain, and so on, that he's actually much more reluctant to use in other contexts. I have 3 minutes in which to cover the next two sections, one of which is The first of which is his introduction of the concepts of valencies to try and, as an alternative to libido. And the whole idea of that is to emphasize the relationality of what it is that drives human beings, right? To get a sense that in which a drive towards relationships is itself as important a drive, instinct, whatever word you want to use, as anything else that might be kind of driven by more kind of biological, somatic kinds of impulses. It's an imperfect translation of the term by Kurt Lewin, Aufforderungscharakter, right? So it's about, you know, that kind of directedness towards other people. And that's a concept of libido that actually has a lot in common with object relations theory. So if you look at Donald Winnicott or Melanie Klein and so on, that they will all want to move Freud's theory in that direction as well. The final point is Elias's critique of Freud as actually having a homo clausus kind of conception of human beings. I've always had trouble with this because one of the things I like about Freud is that he emphasises how intersubjective human psychological development is. Right? He doesn't actually see human personality as kind of emerging from within us or being biologically based. Not really. And in fact, the critique that Elias makes of Freud needs to be made more precise. It's more that Freud ends the story of that developmental process too early, basically after early childhood, and then isn't that concerned with the way it proceeds after that. And that's what Elias is talking about. And again, that's a concern that he shares with other psychoanalytic theorists that want to talk a lot more about adolescence and about what happens as people move beyond that kind of family context. Now, as an example of the sort of extension that you can make of Freud's approach, Elias argued that the question of how the fortunes of a nation over the centuries become sedimented into the habitus of its individual members is analogous to Freud's understanding of individual psychological development. So he said at the level of we relations, there are often complex symptoms of disturbance at work which are scarcely less in strength and in capacity to cause suffering than the neuroses of an individual character. Tim Berard has suggested that Elias's historical sociology of authoritarianism builds on and develops Freudian ideas in a very imaginative and productive way. So rather than tying social and cultural life closely to material and class interests, as insisted by theorists more strongly influenced by Marx or Weber, or possibly Durkheim, or Bourdieu, Elias is receptive to the distinctiveness of the psychological and emotional dimensions of social history, including factors like honour, shame, pride, self-esteem. And just as an aside, you can see that happening right this very minute. There are also issues of pride and self-esteem going on in a particular part of the world at the moment. The foundational work of Elias and others who have endeavoured to link sociology, history and psychoanalytic theory has enormous potential for improving our understanding of the history of the present in relation to collective fantasies at the level of the nation or the ethnic group, the narcissism of political leaders, the continuing and changing role of nationalism in collective identity and action, and the eruption of expressions of ressentiment in populist politics and many other issues. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
My problem as a chairman is that I become too interested in the paper, and we're now very short of time, but it was, I think, worth listening to. Christoph, Egen? Sorry, yes. We'd like to follow straight on, and we might, if we have time
Sure.
for questions, we'll take both together.
So, I go over there. Yep. So what's our paper about? Christoph has prepared a PowerPoint presentation. What's our presentation about? Our presentation is about a new book by Norbert Elias. So this is, I think, quite interesting for everybody interested in Norbert Elias, that there will be this year a new publication by Norbert Elias, and it's about social canons. And I am here for more or less the Norbert Elias Foundation, who made this book possible. It's based very much on the initiative of Christoph, who is here, who did the work on this book of editing it from the Norbert Elias papers, which are stored in Marbach. Christoph began writing a doctoral thesis on handicapped people, and for this he was very interested in to look into Marbach papers and to look what happened to this process of handling people with shortcomings in their physical existence from the medieval times until the modern times. How did this evolve, and can I find additional information to the civilizing process, and which had been published in the Norbert Elias papers. And we as Norbert Elias Foundation, we gave him a doctoral stipend at this time, and he finished the doctoral thesis, a very Eliasian doctoral thesis, very fine written doctoral thesis, supervised by Hans-Peter Waldhoff. And then he rang me up. He said, Adrian, there's this great paper in the archive, and you must read this paper as well. And I'm very grateful for this, because it's an interesting paper on social canons by Norbert Elias, mentioning a lot of personal anecdotes of Norbert Elias, mentioning his grandfather, mentioning his school friends, and it's a paper also very theoretically. Robert will be very delighted to see. The three most mentioned persons in the manuscripts are Max Weber, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. It's very typical, but it will also add a lot of this theoretical debate. And yes, so that's when Christoph asked if he could give him some support by the Norbert Elias Foundation to make the book editing possible. He did this over the last 2 years, 3 years. How long did you work on this?
The fellowship was 1 month. But
yes. Yes, we were not so giving. Yeah, that's right. Okay, but we gave a little money. Most of the costs you did pay on your own. It's even more honorable. And yes, he finished the book in editing about 600 pages in total in the Norbert Elias papers we have in the archive, bringing it down to 200 pages, which is still a lot of reading, but he looked into repetitions. He will tell you about the editing process, so I don't want to go into detail about this. And this book, he also showed to his doctoral supervisor, who said, oh, this is a great book, and he wrote an excellent introduction. So both will speak on the book, and I have been permitted to speak upon the book because they have prepared the presentations in advance. And yes, I'm very happy about this book coming out, and I'm very glad for you to know this. We had just 2 sessions on sociological evolution of society, and I think both sessions will very much profit from reading this book and also getting another insight into how society evolved, especially finding this canon term by Norbert Elias. It has been originally based as codes of conduct, and then sometimes he was dealing with Wissenschätzen, knowledge treasures, and now he turned to social canons. And it's a stimulating new book coming up on our lives. Hopefully, we will have the possibility to translate it into other languages. So far, it's only in English. And I think Christoph is the next, and then Hans-Peter make the final comments on how to put it in the Norbert Elias canon, so to say. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to be here today and to have the possibility to present the new book from the estate of Norbert Elias, originally called Codes of Conduct and Sentiments. First of all, I would like to thank the Norbert Elias Foundation for the 1 month postdoc fellowship, and especially Adrian for his engagement and the nice words about my person. In the next few minutes, I will present the background of the manuscript and my methodical approach. And after that, Hans-Peter, who has written an excellent introduction of this publication, will talk about the content. In springtime 1978, Elias held 2 lectures in the USA, one in New York and one in St. Louis, and one in Munich, Germany, with the title Codes of Conduct and Sentiments. About this topic, he discussed also a lot with his students from his seminary at the same year in Frankfurt, especially with Hans-Joachim Lotz and Arno Wiedmann. Gerald Berger, his assistant, has supported Elias during the preparation of the manuscript, and Friedhelm Herbert has read and corrected the first draft. The original plan was to write a chapter for the first volume of materials on the civilization process, but due to the expanded manuscript, the publisher, in this case Surkamp, suggested creating an independent book. However, unfortunately, Elias never finished this book, like so many other books and articles. Elias himself wrote in the preface of the publication, and that's my own translation because the main manuscript is in German language, and my English language is not so good, as you noted. That's why perhaps there's some mistake inside. But he said, the only justification I can give for letting this work out, unbalanced as it is that it contains a series of thoughts that I have occupied me for a long time, and that have in no small way determined the direction of my own life. I don't want to risk losing them like other some things I've written. I need also feedback and discussion. That will help me to improve what is still imperfect here. At my opinion, Elias rarely used such personal words in his other publication. In general, for me, this book is one of the most interesting books of Elias. He analyzes the subject of human meaning in a sociological way, which is otherwise viewed more theologically or esoterically. In the essay from Elias in the German Literature Archives in Marbach, I found 2 main manuscripts. One shorter version called Canon 2 and one long version called Canon 1. Canon 2 is an early version and is probably created on the basis of his lectures due to the fact that he used shorter sentences and plain language. It has a clear structure and only few insertions, has 108 numbered pages due to the insertion has more page than 108 and 31 chapters. It has no preface, but at the end a bibliography, and it is self-contained. Canon 1 is significantly more extensive. In 3 folders I found a total number of over 600 pages. The manuscript has 225 numbered pages. The chapters numbers end at 28, round about by the half-time of the manuscript, and that's why I've continued the numbering for better readability. In Canon 1, we can see the typical way of work of Norbert Elias. In some cases, individual pages were presented up to 10 times in different processing stages. My work was to find out the last stage. And since the paper was written with different typewriters, I was always able to identify the latest version, only with a few exceptions. In this manuscript are many insertions, and some content was repeated twice in different places. Elias cited an unusual number of authors and also many personal examples. That's why I've decided to work with this large manuscript, but for a better orientation I had always a look on the shorter version, and in some cases I added individual sentences from the shorter version to my manuscript. The long version is, as so many things from Elias, surely not finished. Here you can see the early page from the preface of the long version with handwritten edition. I found a later and a better stage of this page because it's really difficult to read it. And here you can see, for example, the typical insertion. Mostly it begins with the number, for example, here 84, 84A, 84B, 84C, 84C 1 point, 84C 2 point, and so on. It was really crazy to work with these pages, but yeah, it works. Here in this page you can see that Elias had itself had a link to the Canon 2, to the shorter version. That means, he has connected both canons. And in the estate, I found also further folder concerning codes of conduct and sentiments, thought which I was able to understand the origin story of the manuscript. And in the forthcoming book, you will find many footnotes with appropriate annotations from my side. No, I thank you for your attention and will give the floor to Hans-Peter, who wrote a great foreword to the book and who is more knowledgeable in terms of subject matter and languages than I could be. Thank you.
I might say that I'm terribly sorry about the squeeze of time because John McNeill is due to deliver a live plenary session in not much over 5 minutes. Sorry, I didn't realise all three of you were going to speak. I'm really sorry, but can you sort of compress your ideas, Hans-Peter? And I can only apologise frightfully for this.
It's always hard to be the last one. It's completely impossible. That will be 12 minutes here. I just try. You see, I was wearing these masks. Normally, the virus is now replaced by Russians, but I'm not so sure if that is true. Reading the news about the Russian war in Ukraine and watching TV these days makes it hard for me to concentrate on anything else. But I try to bridge this topic to the conceptual triangle Elias proposes in his rediscovered and newly configured book we present here, that is social canon, social existence, and production of meaning. I try to put it in relation to the question of war, which means the destruction of meaning, preceding and following mass killings. Imagine we are caught in a maelstrom of a more or less fast escalating war. We might, as social scientists, try to understand the patterns we are small parts of. Some social science concepts we see around us might sink faster into uselessness. Others might help us to obtain some overview. Watching TV these days, it was Fire and Civilization by Johan Goudsblom, which came first to my mind. Almost always the images of fire in the news mean violence, furor, chaos, destruction. But what the burning houses and cars mean in essence, Goudsblom writes, is collective hatred. In a study about the failure of diplomacy, Van Volkan relates the basic failure in the lack of addressing the underlying hot and strong emotions in conflicts between states and other large groups. In the sense Elias gives to the term, the interdependent social canons of societies mean something like, this is the way you should steer your drives, pains, pleasures, thoughts, muscles, conflicts with yourself and others. I skip something. In a visibly hateful speech from the end of February, the Russian president threatened anyone who stands in his way in the war against Ukraine with an attack with nuclear weapons, the ultimate firepower. This reminds us of the long and ambivalent social process of fire control and civilization between productive and destructive aspects as analyzed by Johan Goudsblom. One could add here Peter Gleichmann's analysis of the intertwining of processes of militarization and of civilization. The role of human affects and their control standards formulated anew by Elias in this book as a theory of social canons is paramount for the theory of civilizing processes and also of decivilizing processes. It is also preeminent for its most prominent predecessor, Freud's civilization and its discontents. Well, I skip this because you might know about Freud. In a world historic perspective, McNeill and McNeill see a dominant trend to an ever-expanding human web with partial regressive countertrends and ever stronger strains on the web as the chains of interdependencies grow longer and even more complex. Quote, complexity and specialization among human beings built initially upon modified predation and subsequently modulated by custom, was and remains the hallmark of cities and civilization. Okay, I skip another thing. William McNeill singled out two as yet not really controllable risks: dangerous microorganisms and the most dangerous lack of stable controls of specialists of mass killings on an ever greater scale. Elias describes the development, or rather the almost frozen development, of social canons of these violent specialists in three examples. First, the well-known Duke of Montmorency, I skip the rest about him, follows a novel by Arthur Schnitzler, which portrays Lieutenant Gustl, a typical officer of the Imperial Army of Austria-Hungary. He gets involved in a small conflict in the course of a theater visit, an almost imperceptible physical contest with a socially inferior man, but who happens to be physically stronger. Although the man tries to help the young officer in not losing his face, the latter walks all night through the streets of Vienna talking to himself, knowing that he will have to shoot himself at the latest the next morning. Elias shows the overwhelming force of social canons. Especially the canon of violence specialists seems to lead humans astray. In both cited cases, this social canon is stronger than what we might consider as reasonable, even more forceful than the desire to live. This continues right into modern institutions and mentalities. They are, in the Western case, described by Elias as direct descendants of the warrior institutions of feudal societies and perpetuate the dangerous construction of meaning. Their modern and globalized form is that of intensely competing military establishments who drive the helpless outsider masses of humanity towards the next world war. That could have been written just now. But there is so much more in this book. Elias takes his usual detour by detachment, like you should do in a Malström, quietly elaborating concepts, although this is perhaps his most involved oeuvre. There is a general tendency in this book to work with ambivalence. One is reminded of Zygmunt Baumann's modernity and ambivalence more than once. Elias distinguishes decidedly what we see in civilized societies on stage from what we avoid to see behind the scenes. The relative stability of those living in the limelight profit from people working backstage, where Elias highlights quite different social canons of behavior and feeling, which undermine the meaning of people's social existence. But there is another and last interesting ambivalence that can be found in the basic structure of social canons itself, or as such. They are, according to Elias, at the same time provided with a strong and sometimes overwhelming force on the one hand, but on the other hand, they are endowed with a stunning changeability, which all too often makes people anxious, but which could also be liberating. And it is this liberating and humanizing potential of social canons and the potential to produce meaningfulness instead of destroying it, which Elias explores methodically in his forthcoming new book. The point is, more precisely formulated, he demonstrates how we can find our ways, which is, of course, the original meaning of the Greek methodos. His three central concepts are not defined in a static way, but they are developed through a multitude of examples and theoretical considerations. As a reader, you could go through the expanding symbolic microcosm of this book and let it go through your mind, with the author hoping at the end of his book expressly for the changeability of his readers' minds. In this way, you might get a feeling for the process in which, in our social macrocosm, we build, as Elias described it, as humanity, our expanding and meaningful symbolic world into the vastness of a natural universe, which appears as such devoid of sense. All this in the more or less firmly grounded hope that we are not, by the hellfire of atomic warfare, pulverized back into nothingness before our natural time as inhabitants of this not eternal planet has come. Let me add one quite sober remark. The precious symbolic world of this book should be expanded as soon as possible and in a really professional translation into better English than you just heard, finished last night in beautiful Amsterdam.